picture a beach in the Philippines. Pitch black, no moon, the kind of dark where you can't see your own hand. Now picture a warship sliding toward that beach out of the darkness, engines low, closing in on American soldiers who have nowhere to run. And picture what happens next. Not a destroyer, not a cruiser, not a single plane in the sky, just a handful of American tank destroyers, dug into the sand, opening fire on a Japanese ship with cannons never designed to fight anything that floats. What happened in the next few minutes has never happened before or since in the entire history of the Second World War. You've probably seen the headline version of this story somewhere online. An American tank sinks a Japanese warship. It sounds almost too good to be true, the kind of claim that gets passed around without anyone checking it. And that's exactly the problem, because the real story buried underneath that headline is stranger, more specific, and honestly more remarkable than the myth. It didn't involve a tank. It didn't involve a warship in the way you're picturing one. And by the time you understand what actually sat on that beach and what actually came out of the darkness to meet it, you'll understand why the US Army itself called this a one-of-a-kind moment in the entire Pacific War. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to October of 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte and made good on the promise he'd made 2 years earlier when he was forced out of the Philippines. Leyte was supposed to be the beginning of the end for Japan's grip on the islands, and for a while it looked that way. American troops poured ashore, air power dominated the skies, and Japanese resistance on paper looked broken. But paper never tells the whole story. Deep in the interior of Leyte, along the western coastline, the Japanese still held a critical port town called Ormoc, and Ormoc was the lifeline. Every reinforcement, every ton of ammunition, every replacement soldier the Japanese 35th Army desperately needed had to come through that port, because the alternative was watching their entire garrison on Leyte starve and collapse in place. So Imperial General Headquarters made a decision that would define the next 6 weeks of fighting. They would run convoy after convoy of troops and supplies down through the Camotes Sea and into Ormoc Bay, no matter the cost. The Japanese called these convoys the Tokyo Express runs, quick night dashes meant to slip past American air patrols and naval pickets. And the cost, it turned out, would be brutal. Ship after ship going down beneath American bombers and torpedo boats in the weeks that followed. But the Japanese kept sending them anyway, because Ormoc was worth dying for. Every one of those convoys carried a designation, TA-1 through TA-9, each one a roll of the dice against American air and naval power that only got worse as the weeks went on. Some slipped through almost untouched. Others were annihilated before they ever reached the bay. And with each run, the Japanese poured more men and material into a bottleneck that American commanders were increasingly determined to close for good. On December 7, 1944, the US Army decided to cut that lifeline for good. The 77th Infantry Division, under Major General Andrew D. Bruce, loaded onto transports and launched an amphibious landing just south of Ormoc itself, near a barrio called Deposito, only a few miles from the port the Japanese needed so badly. It was a bold move, a landing behind the main Japanese lines on Leyte, and it very nearly didn't happen without cost. As the invasion fleet approached the beach, Japanese kamikaze pilots tore into the supporting ships, and 2 American destroyers, the USS Ward and the USS Mahan, were hit and lost that same day. Ward had actually fired the first American shots of the entire war back at Pearl Harbor in 1941, sinking a Japanese midget submarine hours before the attack even began. Now, 3 years later, it went down in flames off a beach most Americans had never heard of, a strange and almost poetic bookend to a war it had helped open on the very first morning. Despite the losses at sea, the landing itself went almost unopposed. The 77th Infantry regiments came ashore, dug in, and began pushing north toward Ormoc with a speed that caught the Japanese defenders off guard. By December 10th, Just 3 days after hitting the beach, American troops walked into Ormoc itself, finding a town already reduced to rubble and fire from the preceding air and naval bombardment. It was a stunning success, a knife driven straight into the heart of Japan's remaining supply line on Leyte. But the Japanese command wasn't finished. Not even close. And what they tried next is where this story stops being a straightforward battle and turns into something almost nobody has heard the full version of. Even with Ormoc in American hands, Japanese Commander General Tomoyuki Yamashita refused to give up on resupplying his forces on Leyte. Through his superior, Field Marshal Terauchi, orders went out for one more desperate push. A convoy carrying roughly 3,000 men of the Japanese 8th Division, along with hundreds of tons of ammunition and food, escorted by destroyers and sub-chasers and covered by whatever fighter planes could be spared. This was convoy TA-9, and it sailed into Ormoc Bay on December 11th, 1944, straight into a beachhead the Americans had already seized. American Marine corsairs tore into the convoy almost immediately, sinking 3 of the transport ships before they could even unload their troops. Survivors scrambled into the water as their ships burned around them, and roughly 700 Japanese soldiers drowned before ever setting foot on the island they'd been sent to defend. The remaining transports pressed on regardless, trying to reach Palompon on Leyte's western coast, only for American aircraft to catch and sink another one before the survivors could even get their feet on dry ground. Meanwhile, out on the water near Ormoc itself, American PT boats and aircraft were tearing into the convoy's destroyer escorts too, sending the Uzuki to the bottom and crippling the Kiri, while the destroyer Uzuki went down under a hail of PT boat torpedoes in the same chaotic string of engagements. By any measure, December 11th, 1944, was already one of the single worst days the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered in the entire Leyte campaign. It should have ended there. It didn't. As night fell on December 11th, with American forces from the 77th Division now dug in around the captured beachhead near Ormoc, Japanese naval forces made one more attempt, a night landing under cover of darkness, trying to slip troops and supplies ashore right past the American positions while visibility was at its worst. This was the moment nobody talks about, because this is where the myth of a tank versus a warship actually comes from, and where the truth turns out to be even stranger than the exaggeration. Sitting on that beach, dug into firing positions alongside the infantry, were vehicles from the 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion attached to the 77th Infantry Division. And here's the first correction to the viral version of this story. These were not tanks. They were M10 gun motor carriages, a type of vehicle the US Army specifically classified as a tank destroyer, built on a Sherman tank chassis, but stripped down and reworked into something entirely different in purpose. The M10 carried a 3-inch gun in an open-topped turret, with far less armor than a Sherman, because it was never designed to slug it out toe-to-toe with enemy armor the way a tank was. Its entire doctrine was built around speed, concealment, and firepower, hitting hard from a defensive position and then relocating before the enemy could return fire. American soldiers sometimes nicknamed it the Wolverine, though that name was actually more of a British and post-war convention than something crews used at the time. What matters is this: the M10 was built to kill tanks, not ships. Nobody who designed it, tested it, or wrote its manual ever imagined it firing at anything floating in open water. By the time the 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself on that beach at Ormoc, its M10s had already earned a reputation fighting a war an ocean away from where anyone expected tank destroyers to matter most. The doctrine behind vehicles like these had been forged in North Africa and Europe, in open tank country where German panzer divisions could appear on a ridgeline with almost no warning, and where American commanders needed a fast, hard-hitting weapon that could blunt an armored thrust without matching German tanks gun for gun in a head-on slugging match. The Pacific Theater was supposed to be different. Dense jungle, narrow trails, and close-quarters infantry fighting left little room for the kind of sweeping tank battles the M10 was designed around. And yet here it was anyway, thrown into an entirely different kind of fight, on a beach, at night, with an enemy approaching not from the tree line, but from the open sea. And on the night of December 11th into the 12th, 1944, that's exactly what it did. As the darkness deepened over Ormoc Bay, a Japanese vessel appeared off the beachhead, attempting to force a landing right into the teeth of the American position. Accounts from the unit's own history describe the tension of that moment, gunners straining to make out a shape in the black water, uncertain at first whether they were looking at a genuine threat or a shadow cast by the waves. Then the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a hull moving with purpose, close enough now that there was no more time for doubt. The M10 crews of the 632nd opened fire with their 3-inch guns, shells built to punch through the armoured hulls of German tanks in another theatre entirely, now screaming out across open water toward a target none of them had trained for. This was not a coordinated naval engagement with spotters and fire control tables. This was raw, improvised combat, gun crews making split-second decisions in total darkness, correcting their aim, shot by shot, against a moving target they could barely see. And it worked. The vessel identified in the official history of the 77th Infantry Division as a Japanese No. 101 class landing ship took hit after hit from the M10's guns and went down in the waters of Ormoc Bay before it could put a single additional soldier ashore. Now here's where the second correction matters just as much as the first. The viral version of this story calls it a warship, and technically, in the loosest sense, any vessel operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy in a combat zone could be described that way. But a No. 101 class vessel wasn't a destroyer or a cruiser or anything resembling the sleek, heavily armed warships most people picture when they hear that word. These were purpose-built landing ships, designed specifically to run troops and cargo directly onto beaches, more akin to a modern amphibious transport than a line-of-battle warship bristling with torpedo tubes and dual-purpose guns. So the honest version of the headline isn't "An American tank sank a Japanese warship." It's American tank destroyers, firing from dry land in pitch darkness, sank a Japanese landing ship attempting an amphibious assault. It's a mouthful. It's not as punchy, but it's also, when you actually sit with it, far more extraordinary than the simplified version, because it means a unit equipped and trained purely for anti-tank warfare, dug into static positions on a beach, engaged and destroyed a moving naval target under combat conditions nobody had prepared them for. According to the official post-war history of the 77th Infantry Division, published in 1947 under the title "Ours to Hold It High," this engagement stands as the only documented instance in the entire Pacific War, and by extension the entire Second World War, in which a land-based infantry unit with attached armoured support was credited with sinking an enemy naval vessel from the shore. Not a coastal artillery battery built for exactly that purpose. Not a fortified gun emplacement designed from the ground up to threaten ships. A Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped for hunting panzers in the hedgerows of Europe, somehow found itself repurposed in the space of a single night into makeshift coastal defense. And it succeeded where almost nothing like it had ever been tried before. Elsewhere in the Pacific, tanks and tank destroyers occasionally traded fire with grounded or beached Japanese vessels, and shore batteries certainly damaged and sank ships throughout the war. But this specific combination, an armoured unit built for continental land warfare, engaging and sinking a vessel actively attempting an amphibious landing, appears nowhere else in the historical record of the war. That's not marketing language. That's what the Army's own official history says about its own unit, written just 2 years after the war ended, when the men who fought that night were still very much alive to correct the record if it had been wrong. The wider battle around Ormoc didn't end that night, either. Through the rest of December 1944, American forces continued mopping up the last organized Japanese resistance in the area, while the remnants of convoy TA-9's survivors, who did make it ashore, fought on with dwindling supplies and no realistic hope of reinforcement. The port of Ormoc, once the last functioning lifeline for tens of thousands of Japanese troops trapped on Leyte, was firmly in American hands, and with it went any remaining chance that Yamashita's forces on the island could be resupplied at meaningful scale. Historians generally regard the fall of Ormoc as the effective end of organized Japanese resistance on Leyte, even though scattered fighting in the island's mountainous interior would continue for weeks afterward, as isolated Japanese units retreated into the highlands with dwindling ammunition and no hope of the reinforcements that had once been promised to them. The Leyte campaign as a whole would cost both sides enormously, but the loss of Ormoc, and with it the failure of that final desperate December convoy, marked the point where Japan's position on the island became militarily hopeless. What's easy to miss in all of this is just how improvised the entire episode really was. Nobody sat down before the Leyte campaign and planned for tank destroyers to double as coastal artillery. There was no manual for it, no doctrine, no training exercise back in the United States that ever rehearsed firing a 3-inch anti-tank gun at a ship in the dark. The M10 crews of the 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion did what American soldiers across every theater of the war became known for doing when the textbook ran out. They adapted, on the spot, with the equipment they had, against a threat nobody had specifically prepared them to face. And in doing so, in one confused, chaotic, pitch-black night off a beach most people will never be able to point to on a map, they did something that no other unit in the entire war, on either side, is documented to have replicated. Not once, in 6 years of global combat spanning every ocean on Earth, does the historical record show it happening again. It's worth asking why a moment like this doesn't sit alongside the more famous stories of the Pacific War, the same shelf as Iwo Jima or Midway or the fall of Corregidor. Part of the answer is simple timing. Ormoc Bay unfolded in the shadow of the much larger, much bloodier fighting still raging across Leyte's interior, and it happened only weeks before the invasion of Luzon would seize the world's attention entirely. Part of the answer is also just how strange the engagement was on paper. An anti-tank unit sinking a ship doesn't fit neatly into the categories historians and documentary makers usually reach for, so it tends to get filed away as a footnote in unit histories and specialist reference works rather than repeated in the broader story of the war. That's exactly why it survives today mostly in the pages of the 77th Division's own 1947 history and in specialist military reference sources, rather than in the popular memory of the Pacific War most people carry around. So the next time you see a headline claiming an American tank sank a Japanese warship, you'll know the real answer is both more precise and, honestly, more impressive. It wasn't a tank, it was a specialized tank destroyer, the M10, doing a job it was never built for. And it wasn't a warship in the way the word usually gets used. It was a Japanese landing ship, part of one of the most desperate resupply efforts of the entire Pacific War, sunk in the dark by men who had trained to fight panzers in Europe and instead found themselves defending a beach in the Philippines against an enemy coming at them from the sea. That's the story that actually happened. And in a war filled with plenty of exaggerated legends, this is one of the rare cases where the true, fully verified version is the one that deserves to be remembered, not because it's the flashiest possible headline, but because everything about it, the improvisation, the darkness, the sheer unlikeliness of a tank destroyer battalion becoming a naval kill unit for one single night, actually happened exactly the way the record says it did. If you want more stories like this, ones where the real history turns out to be even more surprising than the myth everyone's already heard, stick around and subscribe, because there are a lot more of them waiting to be told.